Part 6. Inequality and Social Safety Nets. Let the free market eat the rich. Economic Entropy as Revolutionary Redistribution. Jeremy Weiland, 2011. Anarchy and Distribution. Civil society has become so confused with the institution of the state that anarchists often find it difficult to extricate one from the other when positing a voluntary society. The effects of privilege permeate our culture, our infrastructure, our economic relationships, and our thinking. Therefore, the ability to describe a coherent and distinctive picture of a post-state, post-privilege world is crucial in that it throws contemporary constructs of privilege into stark relief. While disputes about proper means towards a stateless society abound in the anarchist milieu, the most striking distinctions can be discovered by examining the varied predictions of the likely ends of anarchism. Perhaps nothing sets these approaches apart and divides efforts more than competing visions of just property distribution. A long-running debate among anarchists, especially between the individualist and collectivist schools, centers around the justice of wealth disparities. Certainly the existence of the state serves to enrich particular interests at the expense of others, but in anarchy, would the rich dominate society just as they do with the state? Should private property be abolished altogether to force an egalitarian society into existence? Or will private property be the basis for a new voluntary order where the wealth gap will no longer matter? Even if we could immediately switch off the institutions that forcibly manipulate society, many fear that the legacy of privilege and accumulated wealth could persist for some time, distorting markets and continuing to frustrate the balance of power between individuals. Individualist anarchists have had a variety of responses to the problems of historical property and wealth maldistribution. Even anarcho-capitalists, who see large-scale social coordination as the natural direction of society, have different views, such as Hans Hermann Hoppe's theory of a natural elite and Murray Rothbard's support of syndicalist takeover of state-supported corporations. On the other side of the coin, left-leaning individualists also entertain a variety of approaches, from agorist advocacy of revolutionary entrepreneurship as a leveling force to mutualists such as Benjamin Tucker and Kevin Carson speculating about the possible need for short-term state-sponsored redistribution and reform. At the root of all these competing theories, the key question for anarchists remains: what does a stateless society look like? What exactly are we working towards? It is this difference of vision that divides the efforts of anarchists much more than purely strategic differences. Is a more ecumenical anarchism possible, one that can bring the schools together, at least for activist purposes, not by fighting over predictions and visions, but by agreeing on the means by which a voluntary society is achieved? In the midst of all this theorizing, it is easy to forget that anarchy becomes defined by, however humans naturally interact, not how we wish they would interact. In other words, true anarchy is an empirical reality, and we have only to discover it by removing privilege. Arguing over what it shall be and shall not be presumes that we can dictate how humans interact, a positively authoritarian concept. Whatever human nature might be, any anarchism worth pursuing starts there, and the kernel of proportionality and balance that could inform this matter may be sought there as well. Given this approach to anarchism, what can human nature tell us about distributive justice? In any statist society, those who benefit from the status quo rely first and foremost on the stability and security of the social order. How they achieve this defines politics as we experience it. The purpose of this essay is to demonstrate how large-scale aggregations of wealth require an outside stabilizing force and defensive agency to maintain, and how in a free, dynamic market there are entropies that move imbalances back to equilibrium. There is also a proposed basis for a relative equilibrium among people once privileges are abolished. This investigation will identify two main institutions that arise from state intervention in capitalist society: corporations and personal estates. The modern corporation. The modern corporation is a legal entity chartered by the state. Corporations benefit from an arsenal of privileges, such as fiat entity status, personhood, and limited liability, which serve to set the rules of the market on terms favorable to corporate investors and managers. The trend has always been to correct any perceived problems with big business by large top-down regulation, rather than to re-examine the legal constructs that give these institutions such outsized power in our society. For instance, it is conceivable that a firm could argue effectively in front of a judge for certain of the rights of being a human citizen on a case-by-case basis, but current established law mandates a clumsy legal equivalence between living human beings and abstract organizations of people and assets, which is historically dubious. The benefit to big business, of course, is to regularize and simplify business legal proceedings, setting aside the legal advantages this gives corporations over individual humans. In the United States, for instance, the ability to exercise First and Fourth Amendment rights as if the firm were a human being results in corporate campaign contributions and protection from random inspections. It is interesting to see the framers' document limiting government prerogative used to defend not merely the rights of human beings, but those of the government's own abstract inventions. Yet, while human rights are invoked, privileges granted by the state to corporations that no human can claim, such as limited liability, represent a fiat subsidy. Imagine the cost of privately insuring the value of the total market capitalization of the world's corporations. But the utility of the subsidy goes even further because it allows investors to hire managers who have a legal mandate to pursue profits while maintaining a distance from the way the profits are pursued. Highly capitalized firms, who by their sheer size wield far more potential for harm than any single individual, essentially obfuscate the way decisions are made so that if third parties to the stockholder-manager relationship are harmed, stockholders cannot lose more than their investment. The imbalance of responsibility this enables cannot be underestimated, for it goes to the very heart of corporate economic behavior. What would be different about business, socioeconomics, and politics if stockholders knew that their managers' activities would leave them fully liable for the actions of the corporation and could lose their savings, their car, their house? Limited liability and corporate personhood make possible a way of doing business in a far riskier way than normal people would. How do we know this? Because few people, anarchist or not, would limit the liability of regular human beings, knowing that it is the consequences of undesirable behavior such as violence or theft that helps prevent it. In a free market, corporations would not be able to rely on the state for their very existence. Any ability to do business as an entity would come from the consent and cooperation of the market, customers, suppliers, contractors, service providers, banks, but most importantly, management. Without a Securities and Exchange Commission and intrusive reporting requirements, oversight, and regulatory enforcement, it would be very hard to protect the shareholders at firms of any appreciable size and organizational complexity from outright fraud in a variety of ways. The well-understood legal relationships that govern so much capital finance and business activity would become much more ad hoc and peculiar. Shares in corporations would become even less uniform constructs from business to business, since their terms could vary wildly and they couldn't simply be traded as almost fungible commodities. Unpredictability and risk would skyrocket, which is a much more favorable environment for the small-time entrepreneur than the big, clumsy, bureaucratic corporation. Think about the huge stabilizing effect of the federal government for making big business anything less than a total ripoff for investors right from the start. Think about the ways government regulation rationalizes markets to make them safe for large industries to exploit and oligopolize. Think about how much leeway the modern CEO is afforded to run the business in pursuit of short-term gain, with stockholders often supporting them even as they engage in questionable activities. Enron's reckless destruction of shareholder value is hardly remarkable when you think about the level of complexity in which they schemed and strategized. The fact that it doesn't happen more often is, until you check your tax bill and realize you're subsidizing the stability and security of others' investments. The personal estate. Obviously, the most direct way in which people benefit from the institutional character of our statist society is through direct ownership. While there are few, if any, rich people who aren't heavily and diversely invested in corporate capitalism and share in its redistribution of wealth and special favors from the government, there are additional state provisions to benefit individuals. Unlike corporate privileges, those which govern the stability of personal estates arguably serve the interests of more modest individuals, especially the middle class. However, I intend to show that the rich benefit far more from fiat stability and socialized security than the rest of us. The biggest subsidy enjoyed by the wealthy lies in government regulation of finance. By regulating banking through inspections, audits, and the centralized monetary maintenance practiced by the Federal Reserve System, depositors enjoy a level of stability in the system that is quite unrivaled in history. Of course, regular Joes like you and I prefer our current experience to frequent crashes and bank runs, but there's a catch. We don't pay for this service in proportion to our deposits or the interest we earn. Instead, we help subsidize the regulation and maintenance of the financial system from which elite depositors benefit disproportionately. Rich depositors are more likely to invest in instruments and accounts which yield higher interest rates. Plus, they're more likely to earn a greater amount of their income directly from the interest on their deposits. The barriers to entry in banking prevent individuals from forming their own mutual banks and force them to rely on the aggregated wealth of big depositors at some level of the hierarchical financial establishment. And because the rich can afford to pay for maintenance of their wealth by managers, accountants, and brokers, they are more likely to anticipate and capitalize upon market shifts than us. Keep in mind that central regulation and maintenance of markets, groomed and rationalized by the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and other departments, encourages the sort of investment patterns that count on steady profits and interest, phenomena much more likely to benefit the wealthy than those of us investing in 401ks and IRAs. By lowering risks, any entrepreneurial profit opportunities for the little guy that regulation kills translate into the stability of markets and the steadiness of investment income. Of course, that benefits those who've already accumulated capital much more than those of us who've yet to achieve our fortune. However, the extent of state intervention to benefit the rich extends beyond finance into the very real area of asset security. The rich depend on the stability and predictability of systems that ensure and protect their title to their property, but again, their benefit from these phenomena dwarfs ours. For example, they count on the government keeping a central repository of property titles to justify excluding others. This takes property off the market and thus raises the value of their property. While it is true that middle-class homeowners benefit from these systems, it does not benefit them to nearly the degree it does the rich. Socializing the costs of kicking people off one's land necessarily favors those who have more land to guard. Police patrols of moneyed neighborhoods provide an example of socialized security where defense and sentry costs are not paid directly by the beneficiaries. Sure, many wealthy types hire security guards, but they would have to hire many more and pay much higher insurance premiums if it were not for public law enforcement at least helping to defend their property, nor the extensive, expensive system of socialized criminal investigation that makes it less likely property will stay stolen and criminals remain at large. The entropy of aggregated wealth. As I stated earlier, we may find the answer to the problem of persistent wealth imbalances in human nature. Two aspects of that nature are greed and envy. In a market without socialized regulation, stockholders are in constant danger of management and employees siphoning off profits and imperiling the long-term viability of the business. Rich individuals face similar uncertainties of theft and fraud by those they employ to maintain and protect their assets. Because the lack of a state would force those costs to be internalized within the entity rather than externalized onto the public, it is highly likely that the costs of maintaining these outsized aggregations of wealth would begin to deplete it. The balance of power between the rich and non-rich is key here. Direct plundering of wealth through fraud or theft threatens the rich in a crippling way. It raises their costs directly in proportion to their wealth, either through insurance costs, defense costs, or losses. They have to worry not just about outside threats, but also the threats posed by their servants, employees, and even their family members. Because the wealth is centralized around one individual or one management team, it is near impossible to find any fair way to distribute the responsibilities of stewardship without distributing the wealth itself. Having a lot of stuff becomes more trouble than it's worth. Meanwhile, less rich people economize on these costs by banding together with other modest individuals to either hire outside defense, socializing protection on their own voluntary terms, or by personally organizing to defend property via institutions such as militias. Because the ratio of person to wealth is relatively greater, there are more interested individuals willing to play a role in defense and maintenance of property. The distribution of wealth over more people necessarily eases its protection, and since everybody basically has the same amount of stuff, nobody has an interest in taking advantage of nor stealing from others. In fact, normal human greed suggests that there will always be an element of society that wishes to steal and cheat others. In anarchy, the wealth offer themselves as easy targets to such criminals because big estates are harder to defend and so invite more opportunities for plunder. Additionally, it is far more likely that wealthy estates will be targeted because, for instance, it is easier to steal $1 million worth of cash or property from one location, such as a bank or mansion, than it is to rob 1,000 or so common people. The larger the disparity in wealth, the more intensively the wealthy will be targeted by criminals. On the other hand, normal people would necessarily be less likely to be targeted by the criminal for a few reasons. First, since the ratio of human bodies to wealth in a modest community would be much greater, the deterrent effect would be insurmountable to all but the most stupid crooks. Second, once statist regulations and privileges stop making an honest living less of a bad deal, the criminal elements in a modest community are more likely to share in the legitimate wealth of the economy, easing their need to prey on their neighbors. Markets freed from dehumanizing, deracinated centralization imposed for corporate convenience would be fathomable, with plenty of opportunities for entrepreneurship. While by no means a utopia, a genuinely free market would ease the pressures on lower and middle classes. The free market as egalitarian equalizer. The phenomenon of disadvantaged rich and advantaged poor, brought about by the costs of estate and business management, suggests an interesting dynamic. It may be that in a free market there will exist a natural mean personal wealth value beyond which diminishing returns enter quickly and below which one is extremely disposed toward enrichment. If this is true, then that means that normal, productive, and non-privileged people will tend to have similar estate values. This wide distribution of wealth will tend to reinforce bottom-up society and a balance of power unrivaled in history, except maybe in frontier experiences. In a stateless society, institutions for business and personal organization must derive their permanence from their usefulness, not just to an elite few, but from the respect of the entire community, customers, suppliers, neighbors, etc. An entity that can operate efficiently and deliver a steady stream of income, whether in a state or a corporate business, becomes less viable the larger it grows because internal transaction and maintenance costs start to skyrocket. This is a function not of wealth itself, but rather of the inherent difficulty in convincing those with less to honor and defend the property of those with more. The more people benefit from a body of wealth, the more people will support it. Indeed, the state can be seen as a mechanism for acquiring the consent of the governed to sign on to a program of stabilization that is inherently artificial precisely due to its disproportionate dividends to established elites. The state co-opts authentic community support or opposition and channels it into modes that are predictable and stable, establishing its institutional identity as indispensable mediator between the very interests in which it promotes opposition. But authentic community stability is no harder to realize in a genuine stateless society where people participate only in voluntary organizations. Similarly, inauthentic, imposed stability usually benefits those who cannot maintain their position without outside help. Wealthy interests use the state as a way to marshal public support without yielding control or spreading the wealth, as it were. A truly free market without subsidized security, regulation, and arbitration imposes costs on large-scale aggregations of assets that quickly deplete them. I do not think they would be able to survive for very long without the state, even if natural elites exist or some form of social Darwinism is proven correct, because natural hierarchies such as those would not need state intervention to maintain their cohesion. One can chalk this up to the fickle and often dark side of human nature, but it's a phenomenon that we cannot just wish away. Indeed, we should see a place for these dynamics in the legitimate bottom-up society. This theory is not an ironclad prescription of how anarchy must emerge. It is merely a demonstration of how individualist and collectivist divisions can both be served without compromising either's interests. Markets and egalitarian distribution of property and wealth are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Perhaps authentic libertarian means of genuinely free markets, taken to their logical conclusion, can effect far more egalitarian and redistributionist ends than we ever dreamed, not as a function of any central state, but rather as a result of its absence. Individualism and Inequality. Joe Peacott, 2007. Economics, a means or an end for anarchists. All anarchists seek a world free of government and every other coercive institution. This is what makes them libertarians, but this is often the only thing on which they can agree among themselves. Different anarchists have all sorts of priorities and visions for the future society. Their ideas about what goals are most important to achieve in an anarchist world influence their thoughts about how economic exchanges, decision-making, and social relations would take place in a libertarian setting. For instance, many anarchists seem to consider economic equality as their primary aim, and a libertarian social order organized on some sort of collective or communal basis as the way to achieve it. They seek anarchy because they believe it is the best method of attaining economic parity. Individualists, on the other hand, believe that individual freedom of action, as long as it does not impinge on the equal freedom of others, is the most important goal of anarchists. According to this view, libertarian economic and social interactions should serve to promote and protect the autonomy of the participants, and individualists believe that an anarchist society based on private property, free exchange, and use and occupancy land tenure would be best suited to this purpose. Private property and capitalism. Anarchist individualists advocate private ownership, or in the case of land, tenure, of property, and free exchange of goods and services both now and in any future anarchist society. We believe that individuals should retain the full value of whatever they produce and should be free to occupy and use only that land which they can put to use without employing the labor of others. Of course, being anarchists, we also maintain that individuals would be free to pool their labor, property, and/or land in order to increase their economic efficiency, better provide for others in need, or simply enjoy the company of their fellows. But these would still be voluntary private arrangements, wherein the individuals concerned would share the products of their labor and contribute to the joint project as long as they see fit, while retaining their freedom to leave the enterprise if and when they so desire. Although individualists envision a society based on private property, we oppose the economic relationships of capitalism, whose supporters misuse words like private enterprise and free markets to justify a system of monopoly ownership in land and the means of production, which allows some to skim off part or even most of the wealth produced by the labor of others. Such a system exists only because it is protected by the armed power of government, which secures title to unjustly acquired and held land, monopolizes the supply of credit and money, and criminalizes attempts by workers to take full ownership of the means of production they use to create wealth. This state intervention in economic transactions makes it impossible for most workers to become truly independent of the predation of capitalists, banks, and landlords. Individualists argue that without the state to enforce the rules of the capitalist economy, workers would not allow themselves to be exploited by these thieves, and capitalism would not be able to exist. Inequality in an individualist society. One of the criticisms of individualist economic proposals raised by other anarchists is that a system based on private ownership would result in some level of difference among people in regard to the quality or quantity of possessions they have. In a society where people are able to realize the full value of their labor, one who works harder or better than another will possess or have the ability to acquire more things than someone who works less or is less skilled at a particular occupation. But economic inequality would not have the same significance in a non-capitalist anarchist society that it does in today's societies. The differences in wealth that arise in an individualist community would likely be relatively small. Without the ability to profit from the labor of others, generate interest from providing credit, or extort rent from letting out land or property, individuals would not be capable of generating the huge quantities of assets that people can in a capitalist system. Furthermore, the anarchist with more things does not have them at the expense of another, since they are the result of the owner's own effort. If someone with less wealth wishes to have more, they can work more, harder, or better. There is no injustice in one person working 12 hours a day and 6 days a week in order to buy a boat, while another chooses to work 3 8-hour days a week and is content with a less extravagant lifestyle. If one can generate income only by hard work, there is an upper limit to the number and kind of things one can buy and own. More important, though, than the actual amount of economic inequality between individuals is whether the person who has more wealth thereby acquires more power or advantage over others. In a statist world, one can buy political favors with one's money and influence government action affecting oneself and others. This would not be an option in an anarchist society, since there would be no government or other political structure through which individuals or groups could coerce others and use their greater wealth to further aggrandize themselves through political means, as happens in a society of rulers and subjects. But even if money could not buy power in a libertarian community, some might object to a private property system and its inevitable inequality on another basis. They may believe that economic differences are necessarily unjust, or that people unable to work much or at all because of physical limitations would be unable to obtain the resources to make a life for themselves. Individualists would argue that economic inequality of some sort is inevitable in any truly free society. People have varied needs, wants, and mental and physical abilities, and are therefore unequal in many ways. Some produce more, some produce less, and there is no injustice in the fact that this would result in different amounts of wealth. A society or community that prohibited those who so desired from retaining the full value of what they produce in order to create an artificial economic leveling would infringe on the freedom of individuals and thus violate a basic anarchist principle. As for those who produce little or nothing because of some disability, there are other means of providing for the less fortunate than communal economic arrangements. There is a long tradition of groups of individuals taking care of sick, injured, and otherwise incapacitated people through voluntary organizations, from friendly societies to cooperatives of various sorts to trade unions. People who value private property are no less benevolent than those who favor free collectives and would figure out any number of ways to care for those in need of assistance from others. Inequality in the commune and collective. While individualists concede that there would be some economic inequality in the society they promote, their critics among other anarchists often presume that the kind of societies they envision would be completely egalitarian and free of inequity. But although the collectives proposed by anarchist syndicalists, communist anarchists, and libertarian socialists might well be free of economic differences, this would likely take place only at the expense of the liberty of some of the members of such communities, creating an inequality in individual freedom. It is unlikely that people in any future world would all be of one mind about everything any more than they are today. Some will wish to live and work alone, interacting with others only when necessary. Others will wish to work in groups and share everything, and others, perhaps most, will prefer one of these models to another at different times and for different purposes, or even some combination of the two. And any anarchist society worthy of the name must allow for this. As noted above, individualists believe that pooling of resources, land, or anything else by autonomous individuals can be fully compatible with individual freedom. Unfortunately, however, there are some anarchists who advocate outright abolition of private property, not allowing any opportunity for those who prefer a different economic arrangement. If such an economic model was imposed upon the world, those who wished to live otherwise would not have the freedom to do so. Allowing people no alternative to joining the local commune or syndicate would simply replace the tyranny of state capitalism with the oppression of an involuntary community. There would consequently be an inequality between the society, or more likely the committee or other delegates who presume to represent it, and the individual. The group will make decisions and the dissenting individual must comply. Thus, in many a collective or commune, no one will be poorer than another, but some will certainly be less free. This is not to imply that all communist or collectivist anarchists believe in imposing their economic views on those who view the world differently. Many who advocate some form of communal society are as committed to personal liberty as are private property advocates. But there is a tendency on the part of many anarchists to present a one-size-fits-everyone economic model for the future, not realizing the possible implications of such an all-encompassing ideal. For economic and social freedom. Individualists see the economic system they propose as simply the means to an end, and that end is a free society of free individuals. We believe that only free economic exchange based on private property can produce and protect every individual's autonomy, their freedom to live as they see fit, which we believe is the essential goal of the anarchist project. Moreover, while such an arrangement would encourage and reward individual initiative, more collectively oriented people would be free to construct whatever group enterprises they wish by coming together and sharing production, consumption, or both. People in a society based on individual ownership of property and tenure of land would be able to choose whatever economic or social system best suits their interests, personal relationships, geographic location, and temperaments, without sacrificing the option of changing their minds and making other arrangements whenever they decide to do so. While some amount of economic inequality would be unavoidable in such a world, schemes which seek to bring about absolute parity in wealth and possessions would simply produce another kind of inequality where individual wants and desires would be subservient to those of the group, and limits would be placed on those who wish to live their lives in their own way. Such social inequality between and among individuals and groups, and the limits on liberty which it would produce, are precisely what individualists, and, one would hope, all other genuine anarchists, seek to eliminate from the world. How Government Solved the Healthcare Crisis. Roderick T. Long, 1993. Today, we are constantly being told, the United States faces a healthcare crisis. Medical costs are too high, and health insurance is out of reach of the poor. The cause of this crisis is never made very clear, but the cure is obvious to nearly everybody. Government must step in to solve the problem. 80 years ago, Americans were also told that their nation was facing a healthcare crisis. Then, however, the complaint was that medical costs were too low and that health insurance was too accessible. But in that era, too, government stepped forward to solve the problem. And boy, did they solve it! In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the primary sources of healthcare and health insurance for the working poor in Britain, Australia, and the United States was the Fraternal Society. Fraternal societies, called Friendly Societies in Britain and Australia, were voluntary mutual aid associations. Their descendants survive among us today in the form of the Shriners, Elks, Masons, and similar organizations, but these no longer play the central role in American life they formerly did. As recently as 1920, over 1/4 of all American adults were members of fraternal societies. The figure was still higher in Britain and Australia. Fraternal societies were particularly popular among blacks and immigrants. Indeed, Teddy Roosevelt's famous attack on hyphenated Americans was motivated in part by hostility to the immigrants' fraternal societies. He and other progressives sought to Americanize immigrants by making them dependent for support on the democratic state rather than their own independent ethnic communities. The principle behind the fraternal societies was simple. A group of working-class people would form an association, or join a local branch or lodge of an existing association, and pay monthly fees into the association's treasury. Individual members would then be able to draw on the pooled resources in time of need. The fraternal societies thus operated as a form of self-help insurance company. Turn-of-the-century America offered a dizzying array of fraternal societies to choose from. Some catered to a particular ethnic or religious group, others did not. Many offered entertainment and social life to their members or engaged in community service. Some fraternal societies were run entirely by and for women. The kinds of services from which members could choose often varied as well, although the most commonly offered were life insurance, disability insurance, and lodge practice. Lodge practice refers to an arrangement, reminiscent of today's HMOs, whereby a particular society or lodge would contract with a doctor to provide medical care to its members. The doctor received a regular salary on a retainer basis rather than charging per item. Members would pay a yearly fee and then call on the doctor's services as needed. If medical services were found unsatisfactory, the doctor would be penalized, and the contract might not be renewed. Lodge members reportedly enjoyed the degree of customer control this system afforded them, and the tendency to overuse the physician's services was kept in check by the fraternal society's own self-policing. Lodge members who wanted to avoid future increases in premiums were motivated to make sure that their fellow members were not abusing the system. Most remarkable was the low cost at which these medical services were provided. At the turn of the century, the average cost of lodge practice to an individual member was between $1 and $2 a year. A day's wage would pay for a year's worth of medical care. By contrast, the average cost of medical service on the regular market was between $1 and $2 per visit. Yet licensed physicians, particularly those who did not come from big-name medical schools, competed vigorously for lodge contracts, perhaps because of the security they offered, and this competition continued to keep costs low. The response of the medical establishment, both in America and in Britain, was one of outrage. The institution of lodge practice was denounced in harsh language and apocalyptic tones. Such low fees many doctors charged were bankrupting the medical profession. Moreover, many saw it as a blow to the dignity of the profession that trained physicians should be eagerly bidding for the chance to serve as the hirelings of lower-class tradesmen. It was particularly detestable that such uneducated and socially inferior people should be permitted to set fees for the physician's services or to sit in judgment on professionals to determine whether their services had been satisfactory. The government, they demanded, must do something. And so it did. In Britain, the state put an end to the evil of lodge practice by bringing healthcare under political control. Physicians' fees would now be determined by panels of trained professionals, i.e. the physicians themselves, rather than by ignorant patients. State-financed medical care edged out lodge practice. Those who were being forced to pay taxes for free health care, whether they wanted it or not, had little incentive to pay extra for health care through the fraternal societies, rather than using the government care they had already paid for. In America, it took longer for the nation's healthcare system to be socialized, so the medical establishment had to achieve its ends more indirectly, but the essential result was the same. Medical societies like the AMA imposed sanctions on doctors who dared to sign lodge practice contracts. This might have been less effective if such medical societies had not had access to government power, but in fact, thanks to governmental grants of privilege, they controlled the medical licensure procedure, thus ensuring that those in their disfavor would be denied the right to practice medicine. Such licensure laws also offered the medical establishment a less overt way of combating lodge practice. It was during this period that the AMA made the requirements for medical licensure far stricter than they had previously been. Their reason, they claimed, was to raise the quality of medical care, but the result was that the number of physicians fell, competition dwindled, and medical fees rose. The vast pool of physicians bidding for lodge practice contracts had been abolished. As with any market good, artificial restrictions on supply created higher prices, a particular hardship for the working-class members of fraternal societies. The final death blow to lodge practice was struck by the fraternal societies themselves. The National Fraternal Congress, attempting, like the AMA, to reap the benefits of cartelization, lobbied for laws decreeing a legal minimum on the rates fraternal societies could charge. Unfortunately for the lobbyists, the lobbying effort was successful. The unintended consequence was that the minimum rates laws made the services of fraternal societies no longer competitive. Thus, the National Fraternal Congress's lobbying efforts, rather than creating a formidable mutual aid cartel, simply destroyed the fraternal society's market niche, and with it the opportunity for low-cost health care for the working poor. Why do we have a crisis in healthcare costs today? Because government solved the last one. The Poverty of the Welfare State. Joe Peacott, 1998. As the government, at various levels, attempts to cut back on welfare and other entitlement payments to poor people and/or require people to work in exchange for their welfare benefits, anarchists in the United States have been talking and writing about what the appropriate anarchist response should be. Some have come to the position that anarchists should support state welfare for poor people and actively oppose cutbacks, arguing that poor people deserve state assistance since they are the victims of capitalist economic relations, that capitalist corporations are a greater threat to the poor and working people than the state, and that forcing people to work will cause even worse working conditions for many than already exist, further impoverishing people. In addition, the argument that since the state provides welfare to corporations and the rich, it is only fair that the poor should get some is also made by some anarchists. While these arguments are made in good faith and with the intent of helping poor people, anarchists should be looking into the matter more deeply and coming up with critiques of state welfare and solutions to poverty more consistent with libertarian thinking, instead of falling in line behind the modern nanny state. It certainly makes sense to make the best of the existence of a welfare state and take advantage of the programs that have been instituted in response to the demands and movements of radical or progressive statists, but it is quite another thing to look to these programs as the preferred way to solve social problems. Calling for the dismantling of the welfare system for poor people may not be the best place for anarchists to start in the fight against the very existence of the state, but arguing for its continued maintenance or even its expansion as if this were the only way to help people in need is not the right course of action either. As we do in regard to other social problems, anarchists should be advocating non-statist solutions to the problems of poverty. While doing away entirely with government is the ultimate remedy for poverty, other measures which could be proposed and implemented under the state, such as decreased taxation to increase the wealth of the working poor, deregulation of healthcare to decrease healthcare costs, and a return to mutual aid societies in place of extortionate insurance companies, are much more in line with anarchist principles than cheerleading for AFDC. Anarchists historically have tried to lessen the influence of government in the lives of poor and working people. When faced with poverty, anarchists have advocated self-organization of and direct action by workers to secure at least a greater portion of the fruit of their labor. When fighting battles against corporations, anarchists did not call for the government to enact labor laws, but criticized the state for using its police and military to defend corporate interests. They demanded the state get out of the way, not that it rescue the poor. And anarchists have foreseen a future where competent, independent individuals and/or groups, freed from the restraints of statist society, take care of themselves and their associates in whatever ways make sense to them. This historical anarchist vision would appear to have been lost on some in modern times. A number of anarchists seem to have bought the idea that since government can sometimes be more responsive to the demands of poor people than private capitalists, the state can be seen as a guardian against their depredations. This is inconsistent both with the anarchist analysis that the state props up capitalism and with the reality that in some cases private companies provide better for their employees and customers than state enterprises care for their clients and workers. At least part of the reason it is, at times, easier to squeeze concessions out of the state is that it costs the individuals in government nothing. They will simply force working people to foot the bill for any increase in welfare benefits by increasing taxes. In the case of a private capitalist enterprise, the owners of the business are not always able to pass on the costs of better employee benefits to the consumer, and consequently may lose some of their profits if they give in to workers' demands for higher pay or other improved working conditions. But the only time either the state or capitalist businesses provide any benefits to anyone but themselves and their allies is when they are pressured to do so. Welfare, Social Security, and other government benefit schemes were created in response to social movements, not out of governmental beneficence, just as good benefits in many private corporations are the result of strong labor movements, which forced the owners to reimburse their workers for a greater portion of their labor than was the case previously. Governments and capitalist enterprises have largely the same interests, and both can be forced to make concessions by vigorous opposition from their subjects or employees. While workers pressuring their employers for a better deal is simply a case of people demanding part of what is rightfully theirs anyway, recipients of welfare payments and other benefits are asking the government to take someone else's money and give it to them. Many advocates of maintaining the current welfare system, however, correctly state that it doesn't cost very much in the greater scheme of things. State spending on weapons of mass destruction and payments to corporations are each much more costly than welfare programs for poor individuals and families. Additionally, many working people not commonly thought of as welfare recipients do in fact receive such benefits, as when middle-class people get Medicaid to pay for their nursing home expenses, or working people obtain free care from hospitals, the costs of which are covered by the government. While this is all true, this does not justify government theft of working people's money to give to someone else. The money raised from taxation to fund corporate welfare, AFDC, and Medicaid is stolen property, as is the money from compulsory fees on insurance companies to fund free care programs, which the insurers pass on to their customers. The rich don't pay taxes, and the very poor don't pay taxes. It is the huge number of working people in the middle who do, and who support the other two groups. And while many in the middle get some of their extorted money back in the form of benefits, most of them pay out more than they receive, otherwise there wouldn't be any left for the rich and the poor. The rich and their corporations are wealthy because they or their ancestors were able to unjustly acquire some of the wealth produced by others. They were able to do this only because the state and its police and military support the institutions of profit, interest, and rent, which transfer money from working people to those who own businesses, banks, and dwellings. Rich people don't deserve the wealth that they already possess, and certainly should not receive any of the money that is stolen directly from workers by the government, or any of the other advantages they receive at the expense of taxpayers. Among the poor people who receive money or other benefits from the state, on the other hand, there are those who are in genuine need. Some are truly the victims of circumstances largely beyond their control, and others have made bad choices and expect or hope that others will bail them out. But there are also welfare recipients who are simply parasites, who feel that others should work to support them in the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed, just like the rich. Being poor does not make one virtuous or deserving. However, since at least some poor people are deserving of assistance, it is preferable that tax money fund AFDC, Medicaid, and food stamps, rather than corporate welfare and the military, but none of the recipients, rich or poor, are entitled to the money extracted by force from working people. Since such forcible transfers of money are not acceptable, we need to seek other non-coercive means to enable people to better fend for themselves. As mentioned earlier, tax cuts, healthcare deregulation, and voluntary mutual aid societies would all mitigate poverty, even if implemented in a statist society. Getting rid of the state and its protection of capitalist economic relations entirely will produce even more options for people to make their own way, resulting in higher incomes, cheaper goods including healthcare, food, and housing, and consequently many fewer needy people. The end of government will mean the end of involuntary poverty, and therefore the end of the need for much of what now constitutes welfare. The small number of people unable to work who need assistance from the community can easily be helped by one form or another of mutual aid, depending on the economic structure of the community in which they live. Anarchy is based, at least in part, on the idea that simply getting government out of the way would allow people to look at and solve their problems all by themselves. This also applies to poor people. They are generally not helpless incompetents who have no options other than having the state look out for them. In fact, poor people are victimized by corporations not because the state has failed to protect them, but because the state has prevented them from protecting themselves. Laws and other government action preserve capitalism with its profit, interest, and rent, all of which are theft from working people of all classes. Without the state and its armed thugs in the police and military, capitalism would not survive for long, since people would simply keep what was rightfully theirs and stop paying rent, do away with the banking monopoly, and work their factories and businesses for themselves. We don't need state welfare. We need state abolition.